like you said, globalization is already a big word. And then he's throwing some more big words at you. And then he's telling you that it's kind of like anthropology, or that anthropology started in globalization, but like a long time ago. Yeah, it's confusing. I agree. I mean, I can't agree too much because then I'm going to be in trouble because he says it's a toolkit for a global age. He's kind of hanging his whole hat on this globalization idea. But I agree that it's confusing. So I'm going to try. It might only confuse us more, but I'm going to try. So yeah, he asked this question, what is globalization? And I think the very first time he asked it, he doesn't even pause. He just says, and why is it important for anthropology? With just a comma in there. I don't know if it's an Oxford comma or not. I don't think so. I think it's just a comma in there. He's just cruising. What is globalization and why is it important for anthropology? Whew. All right. Well, let's talk about this. So globalization as a word, this word that we have actually came to us sometime. I mean, various people would use it, but I've looked back at this, and some of the people who most popularized the word were people who worked in marketing and advertising and business and the Harvard Business Review. And they got really excited about globalization because there's this idea that you could sell more things to more consumers. That was kind of its first beginnings. And so there was kind of, when it first started, it didn't really start in academia per se. It started out there with the advertising people and the marketers and people who make sticky notes and make them into the world and put sticky notes about where they're going to sell things. And so the happy take, or the what I call the glib take, glib, like a happy-go-lucky take, is that globalization began about, oh, this is a long time ago now. Somebody in the last class told me we're closer to 2050 than we're closer to 1990. But, you know, it's not that long ago. So the idea was that globalization really got going pretty recently, around 1989 or 1990, when the communist countries, the countries that called themselves communists, started to change. The fall of communism, you might say. So we used to have this thing called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, of which Russia was the biggest part, but they were all part of the Soviets, and they had a bunch of places in Eastern Europe too, which we sometimes hear about, like Ukraine. That was part of the Soviet part of things, right? And so that fell apart. The idea that all of those countries were communist or going toward communism ended. There was the fall of the Berlin Wall, or what was called the Iron Curtain, and then something happened which nobody ever believed would happen, which is East Germany and West Germany, which had been divided since the end of World War II, since 1945, got back together again, reunified, and became just Germany. And this was, you know, these were big moments. And so people were traveling and going to places they couldn't have gone before. China, which had been very closed off and very communist, right? All of a sudden, they're starting to produce all this stuff and sell it to us, to the whole world, all over the place. You'd find these Chinese-made goods, and they became also consumers. And now they're making like iPhones and all the cool stuff that we have. So this was, again, new and different because China was supposed to be a communist country. Now, officially, they still are. Officially, they're still the Chinese Communist Party, and they're not capitalists. But boy, some of them seem to be really acting like capitalists. They sure are selling a lot of stuff for being communists. They sure are making some great iPhones over there. You know, didn't think they could do that, but here they are. And so there was this idea that around 30 years ago that we're going to have all these technologies And this is before we even had these cool things, the cell phones and stuff, but you had different communications technologies, different ways of transporting people, and the world was going to get smaller and smaller. That we'd all start getting along because we could travel and talk to each other. And the things like ethnicity and religion and these old ideas about communism and capitalism, that people would just start getting along better because we could talk to each other in one small world unified under consumerism and capitalism. Now, around 2001, something big happened, which kind of blew up this idea that we were all going to get along and made people scared of globalization because they were like, no, now people can go and blow things up all over the world, and now it's going to be worse than ever before. So the glib, happy idea of globalization kind of went a little bit sideways, but this was the idea that, that everybody was going to be united under one big market, and that the world was getting smaller and smaller. So again, in an ideal to try and separate some of the confusion here, globalization would refer to these kinds of processes in the world, the speeding up of things, the smalling of the world, the technologies, the interconnections. Whereas anthropology, we aren't actually doing those things, but we're studying how they occur. We're studying how this changes the people that we engage with. We're studying how this changes the world. Now, Guest, to his credit, knows better than the glib story of globalization that it's something that happened 30 years ago and is just a new thing. So he tells us here, which Alex quoted, that anthropology emerged in the mid-19th century. It's sometimes hard to figure out when exactly this refers to, but the mid-19th century would be, say, the 1850s and the 1860s, during an earlier era of globalization. So what Guest is telling us here is that globalization is not just something that happened 30 years ago, that actually it's a process which had been happening for hundreds of years, right? And that's why we go back to that quote that I tried to emphasize, that people have always been interconnected. Now, we haven't always been interconnected across the oceans, and we haven't always been interconnected flying planes, and we haven't always been able to YouTube each other or FaceTime each other, but we've always been interconnected. And so anthropology comes about actually late in the 19th century, 1890s, 1900, 1910, 1920s, about 100 years ago or so, during a time that people were becoming, perhaps we might say, more globally interconnected, but it was a time when people were reaching out to each other. Now, what's sometimes confusing about this is that the early anthropologists, people like, unfortunately, like Ruth Benedict, who I cited, would sometimes portray the people that they were studying as isolated and as disconnected from the rest of the world. So if you read the Naki Rema, it's supposedly describing American society, but it's as if it's this separate tribe out there, frozen in time, not connected to the other people. And so this was a problem in anthropology because people were portraying others as if they were outside of human history and outside of this interconnectedness. Now, why did anthropologists do this? There were a few reasons, perhaps some of them better than others. One of them may have been that people like Franz Boas, for example, was interested in the kinds of things that people were doing before colonialism, before what we would call Westernization. So he wanted to study indigenous Native American peoples before they got missionized, before they were changed, before, the white man arrived. So this is, like I said, that was the idea, is you wanted to capture people before they changed, before they traded in. And people like Franz Boas believed that the indigenous peoples were their customs were disappearing, that they were going to get swallowed up in the, and they had good reason to be afraid of that. The other reason was, and this is perhaps a not so good reason, is that anthropology wanted to study other peoples like they were experiments, or like they were a natural laboratory. So they wanted to be able to kind of isolate people and say, well, these people believe this, and these other people believe that, and then we're going to compare them like a chemist compares the periodic table elements, that they can be compared along the lines of a formula. And so the idea was that these other peoples were kind of locked in their traditions as a laboratory, or as that they were disconnected. And if they were connected to each other, then that ruins your experiment. The final reason is perhaps the worst of all, is that the idea of discovering people. And this is something that goes to the present day. Somebody will announce that they found a Stone Age people that nobody's ever found. And I'm off there with my big hat, and I'm out there discovering people that nobody knew about. That's all baloney. Everybody has been interconnected. Everybody knows about each other. And so the problem is that anthropology was not so fun if the people you were studying had been drinking coffee, working on sugar plantations for 200 years before you got there. That wasn't fun in anthropology, and so we wanted to kind of shield that reality. And that's why in the last class, I made such a big deal about showing you that when we drink a cup of coffee, it has these global connections, and those global connections go back into the 1700s, 300 years ago. 100 to 200 years before any anthropologist ever showed up on the scene, people were already involved in this global economy. So that is why, on the one hand, anthropology emerges during this time of increased interconnection when there are steamships and people traveling around, but in some ways, people might have wanted to hide those connections. Now, globalization goes from the marketing aspect to become this big idea in anthropology and the social sciences. And so that's where you get those 4 concepts from Guest. And so instead of using little words, all of a sudden, when you're in the classroom, you have to use big words like time-space compression, which is just a big way of saying the world is getting smaller, right? Time-space compression. Fancy. Or flexible accumulation, which I think is a big way of saying that, like, things are produced in different places and then they come together, and so products are made all over the world, which was already true with coffee and sugar and tea and all those things. That was flexible accumulation. Or increasing migration, which is not such a big word, but it's the idea that people are moving about more than ever before. But if you look back, as I said, the biggest migratory mover was probably the production of sugar back 200 or 300 years ago. In terms of a percentage of people moved around, often against their will, that was a much bigger lever. In fact, we might say that people are moving around as a percentage of the population less than they did 100 years ago. Or uneven development, which means some places prosper and some places don't. Again, this is something that we had seen already for a few hundred years. So Guest wants to say that he knows globalization was a long time ago, but he wants to say that it's bigger and it's badder than ever and it's really affecting us. But I would say that it is unclear, at least to me and some anthropologists, if it's really that new or bigger than it was back in the 19th century, which is 1800 to 1900. So I think that's why, Alex and others, this is kind of confusing, because on the one hand, we've been introduced to an idea that came to us from like marketing, and we've been taught that this is some new thing that's going on. Guest is trying to be a little bit more sophisticated and historical with it, but it can get confusing about what exactly the relationship of anthropology is. What may be even more confusing, is that for many people have started to ask, wait a second, are we really still globalizing? Are we in a world of globalization? You may have noticed something. There's a lot of people who are trying to pull themselves out of the global system. They're trying to set up this thing where like, we only want ethnic Italians here, or we only want white people here, or we don't want to be in the European Union anymore. We want to be our own thing. Let's Brexit this thing. A lot of people associate this with the politics of Donald Trump, who definitely plays this up, but this is happening in different places around the world. There are movements around sort of ethnonationalism in France, in Brazil, in Germany, Spain. Actually, they just defeated those guys a little bit. Obviously, the Brexit movement. So on the one hand, people are trying to pull themselves into this new nationalism thing, or trying to make nationalism great again, you might say. And this is not, again, not just in the United States, but it brings up, well, is globalization still working? The other thing that's happening is people are tightening down on the border. For some people, it's become a lot more difficult to get between places. It used to be easier. 100 years ago, the Mexican-U.S. border was no big deal. People went back and forth across it all the time, every year. Didn't matter, no biggie. So a lot of these border restrictions in different places, they're actually new things. There's been more walls and borders erected since 1990 than there were before. So we have this idea of the wall coming down. In a lot of places, it's all these walls going up. Not too long ago, the Economist, that's the way you quote things if you're doing true European style, talked about slowbalisation. They said, we're not moving faster and faster. We're moving slower. People are getting less connected to each other. In part, that's because there's been a new divide between the technology that is being used in the US, or in what we might call the West, and the technology that's being used in China. So some people see this as a new split, and they're going to be making their own iPhones, not making them for us anymore. We're going to be in a new division of things. You may have heard about this, that there's tensions between the United States and China. And so all of this has led to a question that some anthropologists and others have asked: was this kind of, yay, we're all globalizing, more of a hype thing than a real thing? Was it really that big of a deal, or was it just these little devices that we got and we got all excited about, and it wasn't such a huge thing? And so if you noticed, or not, you may notice that actually, back about when I taught this class, 10, 20 years ago, man, you had to talk about globalization all the time because that was a big idea, big word. In today's social science classes, sociology, anthropology, etc., people don't talk that much about globalization. In fact, Tiana, you said that one of the things you wanted to know about was these changing research strategies. You didn't think Guest did a very good job with that. Why not?
Well, it was just kind of like a small section he put right in the end to mention it. I forget if there was a part where he said he was going to explain it more in another chapter. But I just thought it was kind of a random thing to throw in there after like all this other information. And also he did make a comment in it that research strategies, like they've been needing to change, but he did throw in like a little explanation, like what made them change, why, or like how. So I just thought that could have been elaborated more on.
Yeah, I agree with you. He will probably address this more in the chapter 3, the fieldwork chapter. But it was kind of odd. He talks about changing research strategies. Then he talks about multi-sited ethnography, China and New York. When I began my fieldwork, he says, no, I shouldn't pick on Guest that much, but it sounds like just a way to throw your own stuff in there, make me relate to it. Yeah, no, I guess I will say that I agree with you in the sense that people got really excited about globalization and how it was going to change anthropological research. But really, when it came down to it, I believe anthropological research is still the same basic thing. You go there, you talk to people, you do participant observation, and you try and figure out what's happened. And like the thing is people have been in New York and China for a long time. I mean, we kick people out of New York at various points and try to send them back to places, or we said that they had to go back, but they'd come back. So if you want to do multi-sided ethnography, you should have been doing that 100 years ago as well, right? So the thing is, this multi-sided ethnography is also not new. People have always had to go where the people are. And if you didn't do that, then that was kind of tricky. You should at least tell them that there's people from this part of the world in another part of the world. So, the thing is I think that in some ways, we are now coming to a more mature aspect of this where we don't have to say that, oh, this thing that happened, very recently is changing everything. Because a lot of the things haven't changed as much. And in some ways, we're going, I don't want to say backwards. My big lesson here is globalization is not just faster and faster and faster. It doesn't just go one way. And always be careful of this feeling you get when you're like, oh, I got the latest iPhone. I can talk to grandma now in Australia. There's a lot of things that might not be that different about how people were communicating. It might be a little zippier if the internet works, but it might be down, and then you'll be sad, and then it seems not that way. Now, like I said, though, I don't want to be down on Guest because what I think he does, or what I think we are starting to realize is that we are now confronting issues, the issues that human beings are facing in this next bit from, say, 2020 to 2050 and beyond are actually global in scope. They have to be dealt with around the world. You can't just deal with them on a country by country basis or on a city by city basis or in your personal life. I will also very controversially assert that these issues are real. A lot of people don't want to believe that climate change is real, but I think we can agree, hopefully in this class, that it is, and we're not going to be able to solve it from just one country. Some people want to say that the coronavirus wasn't real, but I'm going to assert, as a recent overcomer testing negative today, that the coronavirus is real, and it does have an effect on people's disease and health.